So good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. I know Wednesday mornings are busy, so thanks to all that are on Zoom as well as in person. And a special thanks to our chair, Dr. Adams, Dr. Elise Porter, and Kelsey Donahue, one of our wonderful anesthesia nurses who helped get Dr. Runnels here. One thing I also want to say is we will have a lunch today at 11 a.m. in the ERCP classroom. For those that are at uni, please come. There'll be tons of food. We'll have airway demonstrations, mannequins, and it'll be a great kind of part two after the talk here this morning. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Runnels. He was kind enough to come last minute from the University of Utah and take time out of his busy schedule to teach us his airway expertise. He is an associate professor at the University of Utah and has also had 3 continuous years on the African Mercy Surgical Hospital ship, as well as teaching as faculty with the National University of Rwanda. So without further ado, Dr. Reynolds, welcome to Indiana University.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack, and thanks everybody for allowing me to poison your minds with a new model, I hope. What we're going to talk about today is intubation theory. One of the things I speak in a lot of different countries and have worked all over the world, and one of the things I see is that intubation is taught more of an apprentice model, where this is the way I hold the blade, this is what I use in this situation, but there's not a lot of theory behind it, and the little bit of theory that we do have is ancient and developed in 1944, and it really reflects theory that was consistent with direct laryngoscopy. So we're kind of in a direct laryngoscopy brain mode, but we're actually moving quickly into the video laryngoscopy era. And so I want to help you guys, hopefully at the end of the lecture, your brains will shift and you'll actually, when you close your eyes, have a different model than what you might have there now. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Utah, and that's my home base, but I've got kind of a checkered past as far as I've trained in England, did cardiac training in England. I worked in private practice a little bit when I was first finished, and then worked in Africa for 3 years, 1 year on the Africa Mercy, which is an enclosed surgical hospital ship, and then 2 years with the National University of Rwanda in a Clinton Health Initiative program. And I won't talk too much about that other than to kind of link it into what I learned about intubation while I'm doing those things. Let's see if I can, there we go. I'm from the University of Utah. Talking to Jack, it sounds like we're about the same place as you guys, about the same number of faculty, growth rate. So God bless all of you for surviving that kind of change. Understanding objectives today. You have a geometric grounding in the theory of intubation. I'm going to show you my intubation system model. If you don't have a model, then it's very difficult. If you don't have a shared mental model with people, it's very difficult to have conversations about that thing. Imagine medicine without the shared mental model of organ systems, right? That's a very powerful model. It's a mental model. I'm not a liver connected to this. I am Sean. But the model is really important. We structure our specialties around it, our teaching, our training. And so that's a really important shared mental model. We don't have good shared mental models around intubation. So I'm going to give you one today and you can do with it what you like. Want to understand why direct laryngoscopy intubations fail and why video laryngoscopy intubations fail. Understand a little bit about the innovation and commercialization cycle drivers, and that'll make more sense as we go through this. And then talk about VL tracheal access tools, specifically the categories of static tracheal access equipment and dynamic tracheal access equipment. So disclosures, I'm the inventor of the Runnels steerable introducer. In Europe, it's called the total control introducer, but basically it's a single-handed dynamic introducer. I'm also the CEO of ttcmed.com. Our department has a long history of commercialization, so we have a very special ecosystem that allows us to shepherd products or ideas from idea through the first parts of commercialization to where they can become a business and get sustainable impact at scale. The fentanyl lollipop Ted Stanley was probably the most famous, but a lot of the monitoring you're using, the core pieces of those monitors were invented at the University of Utah. I'm also the co-director of the ASA Fair Swimming with Sharks contest. If you guys are at the ASA this year, we have a pitch contest, and it's really pretty fun to come see. It's usually the most crowded center stage thing. Anesthesiologists or anesthesia providers with ideas that they think they want to commercialize come and they submit, and then they get pitches and we coach them. The idea is not to pick a winner or anything. It's to kind of illuminate some of the challenges that you'll face as you commercialize products. Biases. My bias is that access to safe intubation should be available in all medical systems, and frankly, any place that we intubate patients. There is a gap between academic projects and research and commercial products and it is a real and costly gap. That's part of what is driving anger at universities now. Billions of dollars are going in, but very little is coming out for that investment. And so there's a real push now to commercialize, innovate, but that's different from, kind of the archetyping of an academic, and that's a whole different lecture. So as I said, I spent 1 year, I was on Mercy ships. I don't know, they advertise quite a bit now, but this is a floating hospital. It's got 6 operating rooms. It's got 90 ward beds. Everybody on it is Western board certified staff. And it's a closed environment. You can basically float a first world hospital system up to, I was in Guinea, up to, a country that doesn't have the ecosystem to support a lot of the things that we do in modern medicine. And the patients stay on the ship so we can control the environment. And so it's really just bringing a first world hospital with its own supply chain, its own food, water, shelter, expertise, up to a very difficult place to live, which is Guinea. We didn't do any cancer. We didn't do any acute care. We only did surgery on things that you could operate on once, maybe twice, and then the patient was healed and gone. Very modern. You would recognize the operating rooms. They have everything and more than what I had at the University of Utah. So where does innovation come from? Usually it's from some sort of personal pain. The personal pain I was experiencing was we managed a lot of very difficult airways. Tumors got bigger before they got treated. So these are not uncommon things to see in countries that don't have access to early, easy care. And so we needed to intubate these people. What does an anesthesiologist do when they're nervous about intubations? Like they reach for their binky, which is the fiber optic bronchoscope. And so awake fiber optic for everybody. That was a real challenge for us because it turns out people aren't very good at awake fiber optics. And for all sorts of reasons we can talk about at lunch when we go through our model practically, they don't work very well. They're not really operationalizable across a system. You get a lot of operator variability. They need to have a perfectly calm and cooperative patient or everything goes haywire. And so we were intubating a lot of people like that. I was continuity on the ship, and the other providers were coming from all over the country. I didn't know them. So it was a really pretty stressful environment. They were jet lagged. They'd never been any place like Guinea before they arrive. They're jet lagged. They see their case the next day and they don't sleep, and I don't know them, and it's difficult to communicate and blah, blah, blah. So it was a real pressure cooker. One of the things we saw was there was a lot of fiber optic flogs. Enough that once a week we would have a case that we would just need to say, she's had enough. We need to stop doing this case and do something else tomorrow. The problem was if you spend an hour to 2 hours twice a week intubating people, all the cleft lips aren't being done. And what we were seeing was we were pushing cleft lips off. The ship's only there for 10 months. And we were backlogged. There was, I think at the peak, about 100 kids that weren't going to get their cleft lips repaired because we were spending time intubating people. So that was the pain I was experiencing. What I saw was fiber optic bronchs and intubating LMAs were slow. We got very inconsistent results that were operator dependent. It depended on who was doing the procedure. It's really complex work, which means in a stressful situation, it's very difficult to do. They need a lot of tech support, which we didn't have. And you generally need two skilled providers. As you guys know, there's an anesthesia shortage right now. So getting two anesthesiologists in the same room is more challenging than it was in the past. And it's hard and it's stressful for providers, but also when you're awake, it's extremely stressful for the patients. And so that was kind of the set of pressures that were existing. And then, one of my rules is austerity and lack of resources lays bare and clarifies problems. You can see what the real problem is really quickly when you don't have a lot of things compensating for that problem. So this is Abu Bakr. Everybody I'm going to show you here has consented. They signed consents so that these are all, they don't have HIPAA in Africa, but these are all patients that have consented to have their pictures taken. Abu Bakr had a giant mid-face defect from NOMA, which is something we don't see here. And so this is what's called an Abbey flap, and you rotate a flap from the lower lip to the upper lip. It grows in over 6 to 8 weeks. There's multiple debridements that you have to intubate this kid who's had his mouth sewn shut. And so that is an awake fiber optic or a fiber optic intubation. The challenge was our fiber optic bronchoscope was broken. Somebody bit it in one of the fiber optic flogs. It had to go to France to get repaired. And so we were without a working fiber optic bronchoscope, but we still needed to do the case. So that's the kind of thing that, that's where you get very creative. And so I used a VL for visualization. And we did have ambuscopes, but the donor never sent the screen. So we did have ambuscopes that would move, but we didn't have a screen to go with them. And I put those two together and intubated VL in one side and ambuscope was driven in the other. And it was one of those moments of like, this is too easy. What happened here? And that became kind of the standard way we manage difficult airways. And what I quickly found was I could teach somebody, they could do one and I could help them, and then they could do it by themselves or with a nurse. And so what I saw was the training times collapsing for managing difficult airways. This is a woman in Rwanda. We had a head and neck surgeon, very talented head and neck surgeon at the military hospital, but these patients were getting awake trachs because we couldn't manage the airways. And so she's got an ameloblastoma. This is a video laryngoscope, and then in the nose with a dynamic introducer, an ambuscope, but the ambuscope is not hooked up. And what you see is you get great visualization. You get that panoramic, stable visualization of a video laryngoscope. And now you have a guide. You have something you can steer, something dynamic. And that makes it really easy to complete the procedure. And so this became the standard way to manage those ameloblastomas. And again, you don't see these in the States because when you go get your teeth cleaned, they get scraped off. And you don't even know they're there. So this is where I started thinking about, why are we cross-purposing video or fiber optic bronchoscopes? Why not just build something that is purpose-built? So that was my first year, and then more pain at scale. I worked for the HRH program in Rwanda, and it was a pure capacity building program. You can see in the back there is Bill Clinton. So this is a Clinton Health Initiative program. Comprehensive 7 years, 100 faculty per year. And the idea is you update the entire system and you move from apprentice models for training specialties to deliberate training like you guys get, where there's curricula, OR teaching, and those sorts of things. And frankly, we didn't set up the system. We were just really spare capacity. The Rwandans set up the system. We helped write curricula, but really they owned the system, and that's why it was successful, because having Westerners come and set up their system in your hospital would be just about as effective as having, Chinese doctors come and set up a Chinese training system in ours. But airway management in Rwanda was challenging. So the the vast majority of cases were taken care of by anesthesia technicians that had 3 years of training post high school. Routine DL. VL was available. We did have video laryngoscopes available, and they were reserved for expected or unexpected difficult intubations. We did not have fiber optic bronchoscopes regularly available. Occasionally someone would bring one, but if they left it, we couldn't maintain it. So that was really not available. We had 3 airway disasters in the first 3 months I was there. And that's about a 1 in 300 airway disaster rate, and that does mean death. And that's actually not unusual. There's plenty of literature that in low resource settings that it's anywhere from 1 in 300 to 1 in 1,000 patients are dying because of airway management. So all of the deaths, interestingly, when we looked at them, involved a video laryngoscope. They had a good view, but difficult tracheal access, and there were persistent attempts at tracheal access. And so we know that persistent attempts with a direct laryngoscope are bad, right? That message has been received everywhere, right? Limit your attempts. But often when we're using a video laryngoscope, we don't consider every attempt at tracheal access as an attempt. And so it lures you into thinking, I've got this view, I'll just keep trying. And that's what we saw. And so for me, when I looked at that, VL did not look like a magic bullet. It looked like a bullet. It was killing people. So that's kind of where this all started for me. So now I'm going to get into some kind of a key model for intubation. I think of intubation as solving a geometry problem. So everything you see here today will be grounded in geometric theory. It's a process, and we execute that process with a system that has 3 components. Okay, this is the airway geometry. If I ask most people to close their eyes and tell me what they see in their head, they see banisters, alignment of axes 3. Is that what you guys, everybody familiar with this? Okay. And so when you close your eyes and you see something, that is a mental model. Like if I dissect your brain, banister doesn't live in there. But this is what we see. Now, the problem with mental models is if they're accurate, they're fantastic. If we turn out the lights tomorrow and we all come in this room, we can probably safely feel our way around because we have a mental model in our head of where things are. What really gets dangerous is if we come into the room and somebody has moved the things around and there's a hole in the middle of the floor. Then we're at a disadvantage, and that's where it gets dangerous. One of the things that we have is an incorrect mental model for the modern tools we're using. And so this is outdated. It was invented in 1944. I would encourage everybody to go and read the original article by Banister. It's beautiful. The first 8 steps are all about how to see the glottis. And then the 9th step is, and the tube will be placed. Okay, so tracheal access was not an issue with DL. So this is a CT scan of a patient, okay? And this is where the glottis is. And I'm going to use glottis and vocal cords interchangeably. I'm bad about that, but I'm going to do it anyway. So this is the primary curve, or there's a curve. The primary challenge of intubation is when I open my mouth, you can't see my glottis, right? It's behind a curve. And that's the geometry problem we somehow have to solve, or part of it. But there's a secondary curve, and that lives below the vocal cords. Most people don't have that in their mental model. They kind of have an airway mullet where everything they can see looks great, right? And you think what's happening back here looks great too, because you can't see it. I don't know. Hopefully nobody's got a mullet here, but that's kind of what we walk around with. Most of us have remodeled our VL model to include that primary curve because it's the shape of our blades and it's the shape of our stylets. But what happens below the cords, we haven't actually seen. And so if somebody doesn't help you remodel that, or you don't feel it, you're just walking around with a J in your head. And you think that the vocal cords are here, and it's straight out the back of the vocal cords. Okay. Now, Greenland is a Kiwi anesthesiologist working in Hong Kong, and he proposed in 2010 a two-curve theory of geometry, involving a primary curve in the anterior direction and a secondary curve in the posterior direction, and they inflect at the vocal cords. And I'm going to hammer you guys with this over and over because repetition makes me feel better. Okay, so this is natural airway geometry. It's serpentine geometry. Okay, I like to call it serpentine because people understand snakes, they understand serpentine. Sometimes we get lost in the technical two-curve theory. So I'm going to use this icon for serpentine airway geometry as we go through the talk. So intubation is a system. An automobile is a system, right? It's got braking components. It's got an engine that drives it. It's got steering components. And you put all those components together, if they're in harmony, you're loving it. I once, when I was in high school, put a Porsche engine in, believe it or not, a 911 engine or a 914 engine in a VW Bug. It was super fun to drive for about 3 days. And then the transmission, blew apart because I didn't have balanced components. So the components, we use some sort of visualization equipment. We have tracheal access equipment. We don't think about tracheal access equipment or even have real terminology around it, standard terminology, because we all trained in DL days when tracheal access was an afterthought. If you can see, you can just put a bougie in it, period. And then there's an operator in the system. And so all of these three components are interdependent. If one changes, then you've got to compensate with other components. And so they need to be in harmony and in balance for the system to work well. So intubation is a process, visualization, tracheal access. This is obvious, but sometimes it's worth saying. And the key points of the geometry problem is it's two curves. They're in opposite directions. One's in an anterior direction and the second curve is in a posterior direction, and they inflect at the vocal cords. This is serpentine geometry. Okay, so a DL-based system, and I consider DL-based systems and VL-based systems, and because the visualization approach actually determines the tracheal access geometry. So we'll talk about DL-based systems first. This is line of sight, right? We take this serpentine pathway. We use the video or the direct laryngoscope. It's essentially a surgical retractor with a light bulb on the end, okay? And we use that to actually move tissue and rearrange geometry just like a surgical retractor would. Okay, and we create a direct line of sight by flattening that primary curve, lifting the head and neck, and that makes the inflection point go away. And that's why sniffing position works. There's a lot of, people can't explain why sniffing position works because they don't actually have the right mental model in their head. So we actually use it to change the geometry. We don't work with the geometry, we change the geometry. Tracheal access is linear, okay? So visualization is linear and tracheal access is linear. So the key point is visualization success is tightly coupled to tracheal access success and intubation success. The central hypothesis that drove improvement in the DL era was pretty simple. If you improve your Cormack-Lahaney score, you see improved first pass success and decreased harm and trauma to the patient. And so that's been proven over and over. The hypothesis is correct. It is science now. The DL clinical problem is I can't see, right? 5% of the patients, 6% of the patients, it's very difficult to get a view with a direct laryngoscope. So your training with direct laryngoscopy consisted of learning all the myriad of tips and tricks and techniques, and they were all centered around improving visualization because that was the problem. So the economic problem, and I'm going to bring economics in here because you guys don't buy tools, the system buy tools. So if there's no economic benefit to the system, the tool doesn't exist. So the economic problem is long training times to overcome the technical limitations of DL is very expensive. You know how expensive it is to train somebody, crazy expensive. And you get operator dependent incomes because you get inconsistent training when training times are that long. So the most expensive solution to a problem is generally more training. But we have trainees here. Is training pretty fun? I really like my training. Is it fun to train people? I love training residents. Like, we're going to have a great time this afternoon. So it's fun, but economically, it doesn't make any sense. So I was sitting with one of the minister of health in Rwanda, and we were talking about, should we be training anesthesia residents or should we be training anesthesia technicians? And she pointed out that for a country of 16 million people, to meet the needs of the Rwandan population, if we train anesthesia technicians, it takes 3 years. If we train anesthesiologists, that's 10 years post high school. 25 to 35 years to train enough anesthesia technicians, 75 to 115 years to train enough anesthesiologists. So that, in a nutshell, again, austerity lays bare the principles we operate by. You can see how expensive training is. So drivers of commercialization, there's innovation, that's building the product, but actually what causes the system to buy the product and want the product, because that's the only way it exists. Technical solutions drive down training times, and this is an economic savings. And so that is why, even though anesthesiologists, I'm cardiac anesthesiologist, I trained right when handheld ultrasound came out. Do you think we were super excited about that? I don't know when you trained, but it was resisted. Like, I don't need that. I don't want it. It's expensive, yada, yada. Nobody would ever dream of doing a line now without an ultrasound, I hope. And that's because now what you see is with a handheld ultrasound, training times plummet, right? I can teach a resident 5 times and then they can pretty much do it themselves with a little bit of guidance. Interns put in lines in the ICU instead of, that used to be cardiac anesthesiologists, ICU docs, and surgeons were pretty much placed lines. Everybody else was like, you didn't want a line placed by a medicine doc. Now it doesn't seem to matter. So the limitation of the DL system was visualization equipment, right? And so whenever there's an expensive limitation that requires training to overcome the limitations of the tools we have now, we have innovation and commercialization. And so we moved to indirect laryngoscopy. VL, the approach is completely different. It looks around the primary curve. You get this panoramic, beautiful view. There's no need to change the geometry. So this is a low force way to see the glottis. Tracheal access consequences. Now we have serpentine tracheal access. And so that's a real consequence. So back to our model here, training to expertise for DL, somewhere between 150 and 250 intubations. Nobody can put their finger on it, but most of you probably feel comfortable sometime in your 2nd year. And that's about when we hit about, 250 intubations. 5 to 10 uses of a video laryngoscope to be an expert at visualizing the glottis. And so you can see the driving down of training times here. Blade geometry. I'm going to take a moment to talk about blade geometry because there's a lot of fuzzy kind of thinking around this. Standard geometry blades, you guys have McGraths here. Is that correct? So those were the first kind of Macintosh style video laryngoscopes that were widely available. It mimics or is the same as a Macintosh blade. It's just got a camera on the end. And so this standard geometry can either be DL or VL. And then we have hyperangulated blades, which people commonly call the glidescope, but glidescope in fact makes Macintosh blades as well. And now with the X3, McGrath makes hyperangulated blades. So it's important to sort those out and understand what's in your hand. And those are much more angulated, and we'll find out why that's important. These are video laryngoscopy only. Okay, if you try to use a hyperangulated blade, if you can get a view with that with your naked eye, you're probably hurting the patient. They're not designed to be used that way. Okay, so standard geometry blade. Our glottis is down here. This is a normally placed glottis. So this is what 92 to 95% of your patients come with, was a non-anteriorly placed glottis. 15 to 20 degree angle, field of view of the camera with a McGrath and a standard geometry blade on that McGrath. You're going to see 95% of the people, no problems. Okay. What happens when we have an anteriorly placed glottis? This is somewhere between 7 and 5% of the population. We have an anterior placed glottis. This was what caused us problems with direct laryngoscopy. We don't have a way to look in and say, the dirty secret is Malampati doesn't tell us anything about what we're, going to expect. And most of our difficult airways are unexpected. And so it really doesn't do well with an anteriorly placed glottis. It's out of the field of view of the camera. Now, when you're using a standard geometry blade, there is still force because you still need to flatten that curve to be able to see, but it's not as much force because you don't need to get a full line of sight. And so you end up with semi-serpentine geometry, but it is not linear. Now, if you're using it as a DL, then you are linear. By definition, your eye looks, there's nothing in between your eye and the vocal cords, and that's a straight line. Okay. So using it, you're looking at a screen. So this is indirect. There's some force, but not as much as direct laryngoscopy. And this is indirect visualization. Okay. So you create semi-serpentine tracheal access geometry. So what about an anterior glottis? Like, I'd like a tool in my hand that can see everything. Like, why would I want to switch tools? Multiple intubation attempts, good or bad? Are there students here? Bad. Okay, got it. Good. Your training is right on. So with a hyperangulated blade, and classically these are glide. People refer to them as glides or Stort's D blades. Now we have a 60-degree geometry here. The camera field of view will catch both anteriorly placed glottis or a posteriorly placed, a normal glottis. So with these, it is literally 1 in 1,000 patients that are routine intubations where you will not get a view. And my guess is that one patient is a technique problem, not a technical problem. Okay, so hyperangulated video laryngoscopy, you really don't change the geometry. That blade was carefully designed to match 99% of the patient's geometry by CT scan. Okay, so we end up with tracheal access that is full serpentine. Now, importantly, you cannot look through the belly of that blade. And this is where this is not to be used as a direct laryngoscope. If you're using it as a direct laryngoscope, then, like I said, you're probably risking harm to your patient because the forces to turn that into a direct laryngoscope are mighty. Okay, indirect visualization again. Serpentine, full serpentine tracheal access with a hyperangulated blade. You really don't, if you notice, I use just 3 fingers with that blade because it just slips right around that primary curve. So the key point is the blade geometry determines tracheal access geometry. Okay, so your visualization approach determines your tracheal access geometry. Tracheal access, when you're using a video laryngoscope, it must traverse a serpentine pathway. I typed that last night. Just has to traverse one serpentine pathway. Sorry about that. When a VL is used. Okay, so now our present state system, tracheal access equipment is generally static. Okay, static things do not traverse serpentine pathways without force. And so our rigid static stylets or our malleable stylets, they are shaped to match the primary curve. And so they technically solve the primary curve. You don't need to use a lot of force to reach the glottis, but that shape can't change. And now the tube needs to move posteriorly to transit the inflection point and then move through the secondary curve. Okay, so it actively solves the anterior curve only. The inflection point and the secondary curve are solved by force. Did anybody do a surgical internship here besides me? Did your surgeons like it when you put force on tissue? No, not at all. So that's a general rule of medicine. If we can work with the patient's geometry, that's good. And if we can do it in a force-free manner, that's good for our patients too. And so what's happened is we've had one component of our system that has evolved and gotten better, but the other components have not quite evolved yet. And it turns out laparoscopic surgery went through that same evolution. The laparoscope came, I was a surgical intern, you could see everything, and then it was miserable because all of the tools were designed for open surgery. They did this, and it truly was miserable. And then, somebody did tools that did this, and now, lap choles are what they are today. So the VL geometry reality has changed. When we use static or malleable introducers, the force is directed anteriorly when that tube comes off the introducer. Hits the anterior trachea and the anterior glottis. Tracheal access requires collision with the anterior glottis or the anterior trachea, and the force of that collision is what forces the tip down. So one of the hypotheses could be the stiffer the tube, the more difficult it's going to be with video laryngoscopes, and we see that with double lumen tubes. Right? Place a lot of double lumen tubes. Hard to see with the DL. VL you can see, but very difficult to get them to turn that second corner. This is, okay, it's playing. Praise the Lord. So this is videos we did, films from above and below in a cadaver last year in New York. And so we think these are actually the first films of tubes entering the trachea. So this is the video laryngoscope view, and then we've got a fiber optic bronchoscope at the carina. And see, what you'll see is this is a rigid stylet. You can see the force on the anterior trachea, right? Most of us are very unaware of that force because we're busy backing a tube out or backing the stylet out. And then we twist and turn. And whenever there's high force activities where we're using tricks to solve problems, that's where we fail and where we harm our patients. And you can see that tip just riding the anterior trachea the whole way down. So we're presenting these at the World Airway Management Society, and we think they're the first, time anybody's seen what's happening below the cords when we intubate. Okay, force. This is a study we did at the University of Utah. We keep a video laryngoscopy database. If you guys keep one of those here or you have access, be great to repeat this someplace else. We asked the question, we made a tracheal access roughness score. How much did the tissue get moved? Was there visual trauma? Were arytenoids dislocated? That kind of thing. And then graded 100 video laryngoscope intubations just randomly selected. And it turns out that there was smooth access where the tube just entered and smoothly rode into the trachea. That was about 43% of the time. Moderately rough with multiple impacts, 38% of the time, and rough where there was visible trauma, 20% of the time. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is when we found the ones that were rough, one of them, our glide scopes actually record the room and whose voice is in the background? Mine. I had no perception that was a rough intubation because my job was to put the tube in the hole. So I would invite you to, watch, if you're with somebody who's intubating, Watch not for did the tube go in the hole, but what's happening around. And we're just unaware of that. It's the focus error that we all have. The other message here is after about 30 seconds, there's nothing good happening if you're trying to access the trachea with a video laryngoscope. You should probably just stop and do something else because you're moving into that persistence part. So that would be great to repeat someplace else. We've got the protocol, it's pretty easy if you guys have video laryngoscope intubations. This is a case report that was published just a few months ago in anesthesiology. And it was an image. It was published under an image, but it's an anterior tracheal perforation. And with the double lumen tube, again, stiff tube, video laryngoscope was used. They struggled to place it. They perforated the trachea, found out, a few days later. Fortunately, the patient did okay. When I talked to Elise Walsh, what she didn't have is an idea of why it happened. Right? Classically, we think double lumen tube perforations happen down here in the bronchus, but now we're seeing the pattern change because our pattern of force is changing. But she didn't understand the geometry. As soon as she understood the geometry, then it was like, oh my God, why did we persist? So we're starting to now see case reports of anterior tracheal problems. So what about a bougie? Okay. And I prefer the word introducer, but I'll use bougie because I can't help it. So how do they interact with different geometry? They're static, right? Once you choose the shape, you're stuck with the shape. If you don't shape a bougie, they'll go right down the esophagus. I have a standing bet with each new resident. We go through a series of intubations, and one of them is hyperangulated blade and bougie. And as soon as the tip appears in the field of view, it's away from the glottis, I tell them to stop, and I bet them a steak dinner that they can't get that in the trachea. And of course, their mind is like, it's going in this way. In fact, it's going this way, and it goes right into the esophagus every time. I don't collect on the dinners until they're attendings. So what about a malleable bougie? There's malleable bougies where you can bend them like stylets. The universal bougie stylet is one that's out there right now. And so you can bend them to match that anterior curve. And there's recent data that I didn't have time to get in here. Just there's a lot of talk right now in the British journals, not anesthesia journal, not the BJA, about stylets and bougies. And it's very interesting to see the different cultural and kind of ritualistic belief systems around these. So you can bend it and it can go anteriorly, but the more anterior it's going, the harder it's going to be to get it to go down. So you can flip them, but once they're malleable, when you flip it, it's got a set radius. And so it doesn't want to flip. And so it turns out malleable bougies perform less well than regular bougies because regular bougies are not stiff, right? They bend pretty easily, so they're pretty compliant. So again, the force is directed anteriorly. It requires collision with the anterior trachea, and this is linear technology. It's got poor compatibility with serpentine reality. So static bougies, when you're using a McGrath that has a standard geometry blade, now you're making semi-serpentine geometry, and they actually work pretty well with those. So that's good, but you're trading view for everybody. You can catch everybody. The view is absolutely best, hands down, with a hyperangulated video laryngoscope, but it's easier tracheal access. And so there's always these trade-offs that you'll see in airway management. And you need to apply quite a bit of force, to lift it up and make it near linear to make bougie work, but they do work pretty well with a standard geometry blade. Okay, so they're semi-compatible with semi-serpentine reality. So one of the things that I want you to understand is that our failure mode for intubation is shifting as we shift from the DL era to the VL era. The VL clinical problem, I can see the cords, but I can't deliver. Like, has anybody not experienced this problem? It's called different things. Some people call it the National Geographic problem, where you can see where you want to be, but you can't get there. So that we now have evidence for this. About 85% of VL failures have a good view of the cords, but the intubation fails. And this is tracheal access. Now, again, we don't have good terminology, common terminology. I prefer tracheal access because our surgical colleagues have already pioneered the term surgical access. They separated or make distinct visualization from access. And I think we need to get there as well. So these are large, randomized, multi-centered, well-done, observed studies that pretty much put the nail in the coffin for direct laryngoscopy. The dirt is going on the cover right now. Krieg looked in the OR, and it was VL versus DL. Okay. First pass rate for VL, 94%. So 6% failure. DL, 82%. And these were not novices. These were observed routine intubations. Okay. In their secondary data, they asked the observer when they failed, why did they fail? Was it visualization or tracheal access? So I was super excited to see this secondary data. With DL, 84% of the failures were visualization, VL, 86% tracheal access. So you can see this shift that's taking place. Our failure mode is changing. Precker repeated the study, same protocol, but in the ED and the ICU. So physiologically sick patients, critically ill patients. Again, VL versus DL. First pass rate with VL, 85%. And that number repeats itself every time it's observed. That's what you see is about 85% first pass rates. DL, 70%. Okay, so that's a huge gap. And the other study that came out, unfortunately was published during COVID, was a study out of Italy that actually demonstrated increased mortality with each attempt in the ICU and ED. So the days of like, well, they desaturated, but they didn't have an arrest and they didn't die are over. Like we need to get to one attempt as quick as we can in the ICUs. And again, they ask about failure mode and you see that shift. DL failure mode visualization, 71%. 67% or 66% with VL. So you see the predominant shift or the shift in the predominant failure mode. So the key point is we're as we move from era to era, our problem is changing and our failure mode is changing. So the DL era is all about visualization and how to overcome visualization failure. VL era, tracheal access failure. Okay. Do we have a tracheal access scoring system analogous to the Cormack-Lahaney system that you guys know of? Well, and that means we've never scientifically studied tracheal access. And so that's where we are now. We're just starting to understand the problem. The next step is to set up studies, scoring systems, and actually systematically study it. So for you younger researchers, this is the place to be in airway management, is how do we, tracheal access? And you can see the literature and the editorial starting to shift to that now. So remember the hypothesis, visualization success, Cormack-Lahaney was tightly linked to intubation success and improvement in the DL era. In the VL era, these have become uncoupled. The better your view with a hyperangulated blade, the more difficult the tracheal access. And so that's an uncoupling of our central hypothesis. I would say that a bigger screen and higher definition is not going to solve our problems anymore. So we don't have a good hypothesis for the VL era. I'm going to propose one. But again, DL, improve your CL, your Cormack-Lahaney score. You're going to improve your first pass success and decrease your harm. All right, that no longer works with VL. So VL system limitations is now tracheal access equipment. And it's static tracheal access equipment. We have dynamic equipment available. Fiber optic bronchoscopes are dynamic. I'm bringing to market a single-handed, purpose-built dynamic tool, but you can do everything with the tool we have. You can do that with a fiber optic bronchoscope as well. So the key the key features are they have steerable tips that can move anterior and posteriorly. That allows you to solve the primary curve and the inflection point actively without force. And then they must have a flexible shaft and that can conform to the airway, because that allows wherever the tip goes, the shaft can follow. And so you can actively solve all of these geometry problems without force on tissue. So this is what it looks like in a sideways model. Anterior, posterior, and it looks a lot like a snake. I really teach a lot in serpentine and snakes because people understand how snakes work, right? The head leads, the body is supple, so the body can follow wherever the head goes. And snakes can move through incredible serpentine pathways without much force on the walls of that pathway. Okay, so what does that look like in a cadaver? Same setup, access of the fiber optic bronchoscope at the carina. And so you can see, I'll call them out. That's the anterior curve, and then the inflection point, and now moving through the secondary curve. And so there's no force on tissue. Now, we don't have a good way to measure force, so this is a visual representation, but you can put your hand right here when somebody's intubating and you can feel the force. So this is called combined technique in the difficult airway guidelines, and there is recommendations that we have some sort of dynamic abilities to use with the video laryngoscope should a static stylet fail. So they're in the difficult airway guidelines that they should be available. This was a trial done in Louisville by Rainer Leonard, and published in 2014. And he compared difficult airways with rigid stylets and dynamic stylets. And he did not see significantly improved first pass rates, but he did note that every time there was a failure with a rigid stylet, it could be rescued with fiber optic bronchoscope. Now, they were using two views. They left the fiber optic bronchoscope screen on, and so they had, the split screen visualization, which is interesting because people have generally, as they use combined technique more, they turn off the fiber optic bronchoscope screen because sometimes more information is not helpful, and you've got to process it all through your brain. But again, the control group was the rigid stylet, and so they needed to be rescued. 4 of those patients needed to be rescued, and they could always be rescued with a fiber optic bronchoscope used with the video laryngoscope, so with dynamic introducer. Now, Mazzanari repeated the study. He's Italian, but he is in Spain, and he repeated the study. This time he just used ambuscopes and never even turned on the screen. They were simply pure dynamic introducers. And what he found was these were known difficult airways. So 91% first pass success with a video hyperangulated blade and a dynamic introducer, 67%. But the drop in trauma is what I'm also interested in, because this kind of starts to validate the force theory. That he saw dynamic or superior results with dynamic introducers. And this is what, the difficult airway guidelines are evidence-based, and this is the evidence that that got dynamic introducers or combined technique into our difficult airway guidelines. So recently, just this year, there's been a publication. This is retrospective data. This is from the UK, a pediatric Ormond Street, Great Ormond Street Pediatric Hospital. And they look back and they do use combined technique there. And they said, well, on known difficult airways, what are people using and what's the success rate? And if a combined technique is used, they call it a hybrid technique there. So again, a lot of sloppiness around language. 75% first pass rates versus 61% when a video laryngoscope and a static tools are used. And that's in all patients. And then when you go sub 10 kilograms, 61% and 73%. This 100% is a fiber optic bronchoscope, but there's only one there. So Nobody knows what to make of that. So again, more evidence that dynamic introducers are a superior way to access the trachea. So the VL era central hypothesis, I think, is equipment and techniques that reduce the force necessary to traverse the serpentine pathway should improve intubation success and decrease harm. Now, this is a testable hypothesis. Airway management doesn't have a lot of testable hypotheses, but it's a testable hypothesis, and I think that's what we need to be focusing on. If we can say, well, the tool reduces force, then we don't need to do studies that are huge to get to the outcome. It's kind of the near miss theory. If we can see something that predicts better outcomes, but it's happening frequently or every patient, then we can really make progress. So training to expertise, again, this is the drop on the visualization side. Now the tracheal access side, 50 to 75 intubations is the published literature to get good at intubating with a video laryngoscope. Anecdotally, we're seeing 3 to 5, but this has not been measured. So that's another great opportunity, is to look at learning curves with dynamic equipment. And again, it can be done with the dynamic introducer that I'm commercializing, or a fiber optic bronchoscope. They are virtually the same. Okay. Best in class intubation system. We know indirect visualization is the best way to view the glottis, period, hands down. Dynamic tracheal access is the best way to access the glottis. We have evidence of that now. And that brings the system back into complementary harmony. Again, we had one component that advanced, but like the surgeons, there's a gap. There's a lag between advancing one component, and then a new problem presents itself, and we study it, and that takes about 7 years, and then somebody's got to commercialize it, and that takes about 7 years. So these long training, these long times, if we have a theory to how this stuff works, we can collapse those, and we should be able to we shouldn't have a 20-year cycle between, everybody complains that medicine is so slow to advance, but part of it is we don't have a lot of theory around how our tools advance and how, but that's a different lecture. Okay. And so whenever we have something that's easier to, one of my other biases is procedures should be easy, period. Like, I was a huge fan of the handheld ultrasound when it came out, because it was easy. Now, the people training me, it was variable. About 15% thought it was great. 85%, I don't need that. And we see a lot of that. We see persistence of use with DL simply because, well, I've already invested my time and I'm an expert, and so I don't need that tool. And you're weak if you use it. But my bias is, it's best for our patients when we get really good outcomes, and we get consistent outcomes, that it doesn't depend on who's standing in front of them. Okay. Questions, comments? Yeah.
So I've always been interested in tech development and commercialization, but how do you get your ideas started? So concerns are things like intellectual property rules by the university employee, as well as, you have a good system for commercialization at the University of Utah. Here, our Office of Commercialization,
Is an enemy.
Well, it's that, and it's very targeted.
It's process.
Like biochemical research and less like device development.
Yeah, it's difficult because that is a challenge, and each university is unique and beautiful in its dysfunction for, getting things out. There is a huge focus right now. I'm sure you're feeling pressure to commercialize, to innovate, to actually translate what we're doing. Generally, I find the IP, the reason that many universities want you to file IP is it's the tether that allows them to profit from your idea. Now, IP is we should probably have this. I'm happy to talk to you, but IP is not necessary. IP is, if it's a drug, you can protect that. That's a specific molecule. With a lot of the things we're developing, they're techniques. You can't protect. Nobody's going to sue doctors for using other techniques, right? You don't sue your customers. That generally is bad. And so IP is something that everybody says you need, but what we do is we file IP. And this is my company's approach. This is not what I did with the University of Utah. I did file through them initially, but my company's approach is to file the IP. And then once it publishes and becomes public, we abandon it. And that means that I can't protect it. It's not my property, but a larger company will not even go after that because they can't protect it either. And their mindset is, I want to be lazy and just protect stuff. So this is the difference between clinicians' motivation. My motivation is to get a solution out there at scale so that patients, that's clinical motivations. Economic motivations are very different. It's to make money, right? Return on investment. And so this is why I really think it's important for clinicians to be involved in the early stages of companies so that they don't die before the solution can get out there because you can't make enough money quick enough. Or, it's probably a whole nother lecture, but clinical incentives and economic incentives really drive different approaches to business. That doesn't mean that, you shouldn't file IP or anything. And then each of your institutions will, an institution does not have the DNA of a startup. And so there's a lot of incompatibility. We tend to get our companies out of the university as early as possible. And then when we can, we have a clinician that shepherds the company through. I wasn't intending to be the CEO, but, COVID changed everything. And so it's a real, it's a real dilemma because there are a lot of institutional barriers to us translating, our ideas and our knowledge into, a better human condition, to kind of put it as that. And we should probably just have a longer conversation about it. But that's part of what the ASA Swimming with Sharks is about, is not necessarily to pick winners. It's to try to help people understand and find the barriers that we can break down for commercialization. Yeah.
Do you have any data on like environmental impacts of BL versus BL?
I don't.
Two batteries, each one.
Yeah. I don't have data about that. I will give you my opinion about that. Is those are systems issues. And us choosing one or the other probably isn't going to make the impact. I think one of the challenges with kind of the model we approach, like environmental impact. And I want to live in this world and I want my kids to live in it, but that's going to be changed. The model of personal advocacy isn't going to change things. Like what you use in the OR is not going to make a difference. What's going to make a difference is our societies saying, in general, we want less stuff. So for instance, perfect example. Do you know why endotracheal tubes are sterile and not just clean? Because it's cheaper to validate sterile than it is to validate clean. And so that's a business decision. So as anesthesiologists, our society could say, we just want them clean, and we're okay with that. But there's all sorts of things like this, that we've done a lot to reduce packaging. Initially, we had long packages that you peeled, and now we have trays that you open, because when you make the package smaller, there's less cardboard, less shipping. So there's a lot of ways to approach reducing materials that help with that. But I think it's like with TIVA and gas, it's very difficult to know what the carbon footprint of each of those is at scale. And so us personally making decisions is probably not going to be the way to have impact. It's to just say the principles are this, and we want, and then, and again, you and I don't buy video laryngoscopes and direct laryngoscopes. If your institution decides that for quality purposes, you're moving to video laryngoscopes, they're just going to take them away. And so it's the systems that need to change. Does that kind of make sense? And what I'd say is you need to be very careful. We had a patient that had a complication. It was a Whipple, 12, 14-hour case. and we ran isoflurane on them to not run desferrine. And that patient stayed in the ICU for, 2 extra days because they were also morbidly obese. But, those we need to, I think as clinicians, we need to always put our patient first. And then secondarily think, okay, what are we doing for the environment? And then, but I think that the personal choices are not what it's about. It's about systems change. And we're seeing that with desferrine. Like we don't have desferrine. We have to request a desferrine vaporizer, but it's still available because some patients, it's a better drug for them. Does that make sense? But I don't have data around that. And right now, our tools are single use. I originally designed it to be multiple use, but the hospital systems will not buy multiple use tools. And that's the cold, hard reality is if we want that change, then we've got to actually engage the systems and say, it may be cheaper to throw things away, but we don't want that anymore. But that can't be done as you're individually advocating a bureaucracy. Good luck. A chairman advocating a bureaucracy. Good luck. It needs to be at our society levels. And those are very difficult things to do. Other questions? Yeah.
I used your product on Monday, loved it. If anyone else wants to use it, we do have them in stock. They're in the main OR supply room, like with 18 tubes. If anyone wants to try out, they call it serpentine now, but.
Yeah, it gets a different name every place it goes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Really quick thought. I do, and maybe we can just talk about this during the sort of session, but like where does a wave fiber optic live?
Yeah.
Skill set.
Yeah. Do I have 3 more minutes? I don't know. So yeah, if you think of it from a standpoint, so I would differentiate between awake fiber optic and awake intubation. And those things are kind of synonymous, right? But the benefits of an awake intubation are the patient never becomes apneic. Like all of our complications come from apnea. The body's, reserves of oxygen get burnt in the cells, and then we have a bradycardic hypotensive arrest. And so the ability to keep people awake is important. The ASA difficult airway guidelines, the newest ones, actually recommend they think we should be doing about 0.6% of our patients awake to 1%. Because every patient that we M&M, and one of the questions is, why wasn't this patient done awake? Often it's the answer is, and we know this, that providers avoid fiber optic bronchoscopy because of performance anxiety. And it's a very difficult tool to use. And, everybody's watching you. There's a lot of performance anxiety. And so they avoid it. And because they think awake intubations must only happen with fiber optic bronchoscope, then they're missing the point. You could do an awake intubation with a combined technique very easily because it's force-free. You can use video laryngoscopes. If you use it with a rigid stylet, the thing the patient doesn't like is when that tip is driven into the anterior trachea. You can numb people all you want. When you move their trachea around, they don't like that. Okay, that's one of the deepest primal reflexes. If I tried to strangle anybody in the room, I'd probably be the one who was killed. So people do not like having their tracheas manipulated. We have to do general anesthetics for that, or heavy sedation. Combined technique is being used. There's case reports of it, and then I know of people that are building case series with dynamic introducers and video hyperangulated blades, and you just have them breathe lidocaine, nebulized lidocaine. Their airway gets numb. I got a video. I don't usually show it, but patients tolerate it extremely well, and the operators are relaxed because their mental task load is less. And so I think fiber optics, the place for fiber optics is if you can't get into their mouth, if they've got, and you need to go through the nose, we don't have any good options for that. If there is tumors below the vocal cords and you need to be able to see the entire serpentine pathway to make sure you're okay, that's probably a good case for a awake fiber optic. I haven't done an awake fiber optic since I've been on Mercy ships and started doing this technique. So there's very few cases that really it's the only way to do it now. Does that make sense? And you can use DL, in the good old days, just maybe before us, there were people that just did fully awake DLs and the patients hated it, but because of the forces. So if you think about this model with the fiber optic bronchoscope, a fiber optic bronchoscope is indirect visualization. That's absolutely the best way to see the glottis. And it's got dynamic access. And so it should be a great system. But when you think of the training the operator needs, then the system kind of isn't operationalized because there's usually 2 or 3 people in the department that can make the system really work consistently. But then the environment that they are in has to be absolutely controlled. Doesn't work well on the floor, doesn't work well in an ICU. And the reason is that dynamic access, that component is mechanically coupled to the visualization component. So the cost of the dynamic access is dynamic visualization. And so if I turn around in this room, my perspective is that I turned around in the room and the room is stable. When I use a fiber optic bronchoscope, it's that first person shooter perspective of the visual field is fixed and the environment is moving around. And that is a very difficult thing for your brain to do, especially when you're in an ICU and you've got 2 perspectives going on at once. You're focused on the screen with the dynamic perspective where it's a fixed field in a dynamic world. And then as soon as you look away, your brain has to switch back. In fact, I don't have data for this, but I think that's the reason that fiber optic bronchoscopes are so difficult to use is you're constantly shifting back and forth. And so what a combined technique is, it mechanically uncouples indirect visualization from dynamic access. You end up with a stable panoramic view that you can then move around in like we normally do. And so your brain's relaxed as you do it. And yeah, does that make sense? So indications are, they're going down, and there's a lot of literature around, you can always have a argument about should fiber optics be dead, but I don't think they should be, but.
Your dynamic access requires 2 bands.
Exactly. So, yeah, so those are subtle differences, but if you've got 2 views, then it's wide open for study. Like these are really good questions. One great study would be dual view combined technique versus single view combined technique. And then you would uncover how much is operator stress. You can make the hypothesis that there's more visual information to process. So that's more mental task load, and that makes it more difficult to use. And then single operator versus double operator. When you're working with people, you have to communicate, and that can be really challenging in the best of circumstances. When I was on Mercy ships and I would have Russian anesthesiologists and me, it becomes very difficult to communicate. And so again, that's more mental task load for the provider. And so the basic theory that I'm working under is, as much as we can reduce the mental task load, that we should see better outcomes. And so single view, unless you need 2 views, unless you're worried about what's below the carina, or below the vocal cords, and then a single operator. When you're stressed, it's just easier to do it yourself. And you see this with attendings, right? When they're stressed, it's just like, I'm going to put that in myself. I'm not going to direct you anymore, because communication is a lot of mental task load. And so these all become, once you have a model, you can start testing these hypotheses and set up studies that would test all of those different parts of the model. And that's the important thing is, if we don't have a theory, then we're not really doing science. Science is theory, hypothesis generation that we can test, and then testing. And then that feedback loop of just your theory, new hypothesis, test. That's what advances things quickly. And that's generally not the way we do airway management. We just say, does one work better than the other? And that's not real science.